and welcome to Dutch the Podcast. My name is Mike. Right there is the publisher of Dutch the Magazine, executive producer and host of this here podcast, Dutch the Podcast. Hi, Tom Byfoot. How are you?
Hi, Mike Whitson. How are you doing? I'm well. I'm keeping well. I hope you are also.
I am. Listen, I have to tell you, it's a dead giveaway that we've recorded two of these in the summer together because I have not managed to change out of my summer beach wear for two episodes. I promise you, no laundry was done in the making of this show, just the show itself. But that shouldn't dissuade you from subscribing to the show and picking up on all the great interviews we've done over the last two seasons as we head into a third season not too far down the road with some great guests. I'll recommend subscribe and hit the notification button on YouTube, subscribe on Spotify or Apple or wherever you're listening to it. Every show is fascinating thanks to our good friend Tom. Today's no exception to that. Tom, who are we speaking to today?
Today we're hearing about a very interesting story, also a very tragic story. It's been told by Eric Philpott. Eric is a filmmaker from Ontario, and he is in the process of making a film about a workplace accident that took place in Ontario in 1957. Now, you may wonder what that's got to do with Dutch the Podcast. Well, all 6 fatal casualties in that workplace accident were recent Dutch immigrants who came to Ontario in the 1950s with that huge wave. 200,000 Dutch immigrants came to Canada in the 1950s. They started to work with great hopes for the future, but they had to do manual labor often that Canadians themselves did not want to do. As new immigrants, they took every opportunity that came their way, and they were caught up in this awful tragedy. Left one son and father and son both killed in the accident. A number of other recent immigrants leaving families behind. Eric has a very personal connection with the tragedy, and I'm not going to talk about that. I'll let Eric talk about that because he does a great job at that. And this is a film that once it's shown, we're expecting in 2025, everyone should go and watch it.
Let's have a listen to the conversation Tom had with Eric about his new film.
Hello and welcome to Dutch the Podcast. We're very happy to have Eric Philpott on today. Welcome to the podcast, Eric.
Thank you so much, Tom. Great to be here.
Eric, you're a filmmaker. You're working on a project called Dresden 1957, which is about a tragic workplace accident in which 6 Dutch immigrant workers were killed. To begin with, maybe, where is Dresden?
Dresden is in Chatham in Kent County. It's kind of close to Windsor. So it's really right on the very westernmost part of southwestern Ontario. And so that's, part of where the story occurs. And the full area of the story is from Dresden all the way over to London and Aylmer. The men who died actually lived in and around Aylmer, worked for a company in St. Thomas near London. And this company had this job then in Dresden.
These are all towns in southwestern Ontario.
That's right. That's right.
In Canada.
Yeah.
And now, of course, this happened in 1957, as the title says. In the 1950s, a lot of Dutch immigrants settled in that area, huge numbers.
Yes.
Maybe can you fill us in a little bit about the Dutch immigrant population in the area, because it plays such a big part in the story?
Yes, I think it's important to remember that Holland, like the rest of Europe, was quite devastated by World War II. Holland had been occupied. The Germans had not, taken good care of the country, so to speak. And the economy was really in a shambles. And Holland was in a unique position as one of the few countries that, despite the war and all the trials that the population had gone through, their population had actually grown quite a bit. So there was a belief in Holland at the time that there's not much of a future here. and they were actively encouraging people to leave. They say that in the late 40s, 1 in 3 Dutch people was thinking of emigrating. And in the end, over 500,000 did, which is a lot of people for a small country. The Dutch government actively encouraged this. They actually paid people, or they paid their travel, their to leave the country. So they were even incentivizing people to leave. Today, modern Dutch economists would say that wasn't maybe the best strategy, but at the time, it was simply believed there wasn't much of a future there. A lot of the people, and the people in our story in particular, they were people who wanted to own their farms. So they were real farmers. And so that was a real attraction, the idea that the thought and hope that one day they would be able to own their own farm, which for some people in Holland was simply not even ever going to happen. There just wasn't enough space and land. So that was a factor. And just to continue with this, well, shall I continue telling you about that?
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, there was this big movement of people. 200,000 of them came to Canada. You
That's
said
right.
500,000 left the country in total. Others went to Australia, United States. Canada got the largest number. Canada needed farm laborers and farmers, and
That's right.
Holland just had too many, or felt at the time that they had too many people.
That's right. And so this is actually important and is a part of the story, because part of the deal for the vast majority of Dutch immigrants was they'd have to work for a Canadian farmer for a year, or sometimes half a year, but usually for 1 year. There was a shortage of labor in Canada because of World War II also. Either young men had died or had, seen the world and didn't want to stay on a farm anymore, kind of thing. So the Canadians had a real deficit, and the Dutch felt they had a surplus, so that seemed like a good match. In reality, though, this could often be a recipe for real abuse and mistreatment. Immigrants were regularly just simply dropped. I mean, I've heard more than a few stories of people arriving, in Canada. They're at the train station, and the farmer just tells them on the phone, "Sorry, I don't need you anymore." Families had to live sometimes in incredibly unsanitary conditions, houses that really weren't habitable, that had no running water. And sometimes, I mean, obviously there were also good farmers. So, it's not everybody had a terrible story, but there's a shocking number of terrible stories, even to the point of physical abuse. One family in our film actually had to sort of sneak out of their house at night, each, for several weeks, emptying their household very carefully on the side of the house that the farmer couldn't see, as they slowly got their household out so they could slip out without the farmer even knowing. This family even had help from an employee at the embassy in Ottawa. So that's sort of indicative of, it wasn't always an easy ride for them in those first few years.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I have heard a lot of those stories as well. And it was a very tough time. Also, don't forget that a lot, or most, or almost all of these people did not speak a word of English, and ended up in a country where, and often they've been, they lived in decent housing, ended up living without electricity, without running water, which they've been used to in the Netherlands. Yes, this is a topic for a whole separate podcast, I think. But let's get back to your story, maybe, Eric. So I believe you told me you are half Dutch yourself. Your father was English. Your mom was Dutch. What's your background? And tell us maybe a little bit about your parents as well.
Yeah, so my parents met in Holland. My father, who was born in England and had spent a couple of years in Canada, and that's part of the story we'll get to in a moment. But my father then decided to do his master's, or a master's type of engineering. He was an engineer. He went to Holland and he was studying in Delft, and my mother was a student in Leiden at the time. And at some point, my mother was coaxed to go out to a dance with international students in The Hague. And that's where she met my father. And basically, that's where their story began. After they got married, not long after they got married, they came to Canada. And I was born in Ottawa, which means I'm half Dutch, half English, and completely Canadian. That's 200%, right? So that's how I got my start and how my parents got their start. I myself and my family actually had a fairly international childhood. At the age of 5, we moved to Singapore when my father was working on the Singapore harbor. After a few years in Singapore, we went to Denmark. Then we actually lived in Holland. So I lived in Rotterdam with my grandparents for 1 school year when I was in grade
Wow.
2 or 3. Yeah, that's right. And then Montreal, then finally back to Toronto, where we had sort of started that journey. Then later on, when I was in grade 12, I went to school at a school in New York. And then as an adult, I was a teacher in Germany, of all places. My Dutch relatives were not too keen on that, actually. In fact, I was
Oh,
surprised. I didn't realize that the kind of the antipathy from the war and the really difficult experiences that they and so many people had could carry over into adulthood. I think they forgave me over time. But I did my degree in German. So being a teacher in Germany allowed me to actually learn the language properly, and that was interesting. I actually taught history. I taught English, but I also taught history in Germany. And so, and I continued as a history teacher back in Toronto after that. And then I spent about 20 years working in film and broadcast technologies, which leads me to this project. So it kind of combines bits of my past. Obviously both of my parents are connected to this story, or my backgrounds, my love of history, and then of course all this work I've done in film and broadcast is kind of training and preparation for this project.
Fascinating. That's a fantastic life story, Eric. So many experiences. Yeah, and about the German thing. I mean, it indicates how bad really the German occupation was, and it's waned. We're 3 generations on by now, but as we are speaking, people may listen later, but as we're speaking, the European Soccer Championships are on. When Holland plays Germany in soccer, that's always, of course, a big event. Yeah. But let's get back to Dresden. So your dad was an engineer. He was the site engineer on a construction site, and the contractor that was doing the work employed a lot of Dutch immigrants. Now, let's maybe start with what was the project, what was the purpose, and who were the main players, the main people involved in the project?
Right. Well, actually, maybe to set the stage there, I never knew any of this. I certainly had seen some photos of my dad in Canada, and I knew he'd worked in the far north and stuff like that. I didn't know this story. Actually, it was only a few years ago I asked my mother, what did Dad do in Canada before he met you? And this is the first time I even heard this story. So she told me that he had been the site engineer on this construction project. They were building a pumping station. They were digging a deep pit. My mom said, my father was concerned about the safety and had talked to the contractor. The contractor was, an older, more experienced man. My dad was 25 at the time. And they didn't do anything about it. And then there was a cave-in. And my father, I think, was kind of shocked, not only by
so they're digging in the ground, and then
yes,
like the sides come down.
I'll tell you that. I'm sorry, I'm giving you kind of the backstory first.
Okay.
And so, but that's what I had heard. And the funny thing is, actually, when I tried to find any information about this on the internet, I couldn't find anything. But then a few years after that, my mother found his diary and photo album, drawings, letters, and it is all there in black and white. This is exactly what happened. Even the first night when he arrived in Dresden, before he'd even started working. So he was living in Toronto. He had a home in Toronto with a couple of other young British engineers, probably having a great time partying on the weekends or whatever. But he'd drive to Dresden, which is a good long drive, 3 hours probably each week. And so he arrived in, I guess, a Wednesday night probably, and went to look at the site. And he wrote about it in his diary. He said, this is pretty steep. We'll probably need to do soil testing. My father could see there was a risk before they even started this project. So that's how this was sort of all laid out. And now I forget where we are in the question. Maybe you.
So the project, what it was? So you said it was a pumping station there.
Oh yeah, sorry. Thank you. This is actually an interesting thing. So it turns out this is actually connected to a pretty interesting part of Ontario's history. The 50s, of course, is a time of rapidly growing populations and also rapidly growing industry. And in Ontario, with the exception of Toronto, which had a large water treatment plant that they built decades earlier, all the other towns had well water, like aquifers. The towns could not keep up. They're running out of water, and the drinking water is tasting worse and so forth. And it's too expensive for most towns to build that kind of infrastructure. So the Ontario government created the Ontario Water Resources Commission, which would finance the construction of water, water facilities like treatment plants and also sewage. That was also the other half of the problem, right? And so they would finance it, and then the towns would each pay it back with user fees over 20, 30 years. And this is actually exactly what they did with hydro, the same way that they financed hydro. The provincial government financed it, and then the municipalities would sort of pay it back over time. So this started in 1956, this commission. In the end, it did water treatment in practically every town in Ontario. Was funded this way. But one of the very first projects was Dresden. So I've now, because I was researching, and it's very difficult finding this information, but eventually finding it, the Water Resources Commission hired my father's engineering company, he didn't know it, he worked for it. He was a junior engineer. And that company then did the tender and then chose the contractor. And then when the project started, they sent a junior engineer, and that's my father. And his job is to basically supervise the construction to make sure it's built according to the plans, right? That's his job. He's got the plans, and they're, as they're building, are they using the materials correctly? And from his diary, I know that was a pretty active job. He was a little bit like the project manager. The contractor's doing the building, but he's finding out who's going to get the concrete. Is it the right concrete? Where's the steel reinforcement? All that kind of thing. So it's quite busy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, carry on, Eric.
Okay, so that's how this started. Once construction began, though, the first week or so was, setting out. They already on day one made a decision. Okay, the riverbank is not that solid, and they actually moved it in and over a little bit from the original location that they had planned to build it on. So they already had acknowledged that risk at that point. And then as you read through the diary and stuff like that, you can see, increasing, basically the red flags kind of go up, 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 up as he discovers, they're not going to put reinforcement in when they do the excavation. That's surprising, my dad writes. I was surprised, but obviously concerned, right? I don't know every time, but at least 5 or 6 times he would have talked with the contractor or the foreman. And the foreman, by the way, is Dutch and also died in this tragedy. So he's raising it. And in the end, he phones his boss and asks for advice. And his boss says, he writes in his diary that his boss suggested, tell Keeler, the contractor was Keeler, Alvin Keeler, tell Keeler it's in his own interest to get soil testing. Now, soil testing is what would have told them this is incredibly dangerous. Don't dig here. Or dig it so wide there's no possibility of a cave-in, which would not actually be economical. Really, it was a bad site. That's the truth. But without soil testing, it was kind of more of a guess to them than it was a established fact. And finally, on August the 12th, 1957, my dad puts it in writing and sends a letter to Keeler, which Keeler probably got the day of the cave-in, but by then they're already working on it. So on the 13th, they got the pit all the way down to the bottom. This is the first moment when the men are actually working in the pit. On the river.
Okay, talking about the men, maybe backtrack a little bit.
Yes.
The contractor. How many people working on the construction, and who were they?
That's a good question. So there's more than just the guys from Aylmer. Okay. There are some locals, including one Dutch guy, or a 19-year-old Harry Okema, another who was probably in his 60s, Henry van der Veen, whose wife made dinner for the Dutch guy, for the Aylmer crew.
And the Aylmer crew, that was
those are the 5 men, plus the foreman are the 6 who then died. So they were. There was a man, Jan Bramer, who was 43 years old when this happened, when he died. There was Hendrik Drent, the oldest, who was 58. There was Anna Hovius, who was 39, and his eldest son, Wilfred, or Wiebrand in Dutch. Wilfred was 19. And Jan Oldewening, and then the foreman, Dirk Rijksen. So
But
that's
the contractor himself was a local contractor. Canadian,
the contractor,
right?
was closer actually to the city of London. So this is a good 2 hours away. They all come from about 2 hours away from Dresden itself, but they'd won this contract. So they went there, and the guys would sleep there. And my dad did too. My dad roomed with somebody. And this whole project, by the way, the waterworks project, took about 10 months. So my father was there for 10 months. This accident happened after the second week. So it happened.
Yeah, so the accident we just gotten to that, right? You
Yes.
said this was the first day that they actually went into the excavation.
That's right.
And it's very early on, and your father has multiple times spoken to the contractor about soil testing, even sought advice from the firm back in Toronto. And as far as we know, no soil testing took place.
Correct.
Or even if it was ignored.
I think we know that no soil testing, and in fact, no inspection. In fact, other regulations were not followed. Maybe I'll get to that in a second, but
yeah, we can get to that maybe after. But at this point, so it's the which day to get exactly? August.
So on Monday, I think it was Tuesday, the 13th of August, is when they got to the bottom. They dug with the backhoes to the depth. At that point, they needed men to go in to sort of square the bottom of the pit, so they dig that out by hand, and then I think they poured a flat concrete on the bottom just to have a clean surface to work on the following day. And it's on the 14th that they were then ready to pour the foundation. As it turns out, they'd been having small cave-ins all through this project. In fact, there had been one small cave-in the night of the 13th that my father never knew about, because the men had already cleaned it up. By the time my dad got there at 7:15, these guys were up early. They'd already cleaned away that small cave-in. So there were plenty of signs, and people knew about it. In fact, at least 5 of the men were worried about this job. And, in one case, Jan Oldewening's wife tried to persuade him to call in sick and stay home not go to Dresden that week. Anna Hovius told his wife, it's a dangerous job, but it's a job. If anything happens.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, remember, these were Dutch immigrants. They need to make they can't risk their job by not going, calling in sick, whatever.
And that's a very important part of this. This is a story that is not only history, it's an example of how the immigrant worker is vulnerable, how they need the job. And they know that if they're going to I don't want to go in that pit. Well, not only may they not have the job with this guy, but this guy might tell other employers. So this is an illustration of what vulnerability actually means in practice, right? So they went in, on the 14th, at incredible speed, by the way, they placed in the forms, the plywood forms. They had built that outside, but they put them in, and they've got all the steel reinforcing rods in place. And that's a tremendous amount. If you look at the photos, you can see how much they've done in half a day, right? And around lunchtime, the foreman, Dirk Rijksen, decides, okay, we're far enough along. Let's get the concrete. So they order the concrete, and the first truck comes at 5 o'clock, and they start pouring the concrete. Now, I'm going to reiterate where they are. So the bank on the hole that they're in is about, on the riverside, it's about 15 feet, right? But the bank rises steeply. So the front is 15 feet deep, and on the back, which is at the top of the riverbank itself, it's 35 feet deep. And the sides, they go up pretty sharply, right? So they're in a very deep hole. They pour the first load of concrete. Then they wait for the second truck, which is a little bit late. Then they start pouring the second load of concrete. At one point, Harry Okema, the 19-year-old who lives in Dresden but is also Dutch, gets called home for dinner. That saves Harry's life, actually. And so he goes home. The guys are working at 7 o'clock. They are probably within 15 minutes or half an hour of done. They would have been out of that pit. And as they're at that moment, the contractor who's been doing something with the plumber for a long, talking with the plumber, he was down standing on one corner of the pit, talking to the foreman, Dirk Reichson, on a river, who's standing on the riverside of the pit. And when this happens, the opposite wall, the east wall, it just, I think that there's a crack that appears along the bottom, and then the whole front just lifts out and falls down. And at this point, it becomes this sheer terror and chaos. And Dirk Reichson, the foreman, he is either thrown in by the cave-in because he's killed in this, or he may have been trying to pull one of the men out, which is one of those things you try to figure out as you look through the newspapers and kind of piece together what does make sense, what doesn't make sense. There's plenty of stuff that makes no sense. For example, eyewitnesses claiming that the men screamed for 3 minutes. Guaranteed not true. They're covered in dirt, and they're probably, if not instantly dead, they're instantly unconscious by the incredible weight of this wet clay. It was so heavy. It took actually 38 hours to get all of the bodies out. That's just because it was so incredibly heavy and difficult to dig in. So this is the moment when, the disaster has happened. The town of Dresden, somebody who...
How many population do you know where Dresden?
I do know. The town of Dresden was a little under 2,000 in 1957, and today it's a little bit over 2,000. That town, it's very interesting. It's almost like a time capsule. If you look on the main street today, it looks almost like the photos of the main street that my dad took in 1957. It really is a bit of a time capsule, maybe a world that many of us wish we could have, where people actually do remember things going back, right? They have the town has a memory, not a complete memory of this event, by the way, but they do have a memory. They do have an identity. So they're definitely an interesting place.
Sorry. And the men had just been buried alive.
Yes.
Hopefully unconscious, as you said, but
my father runs to the top. He was actually testing concrete. His back was turned to the pit at that moment, but when he turns around and sees what's happening, he runs past Keeler, the contractor, who's actually trapped. He was buried up to his thighs or whatever in mud, and he had to be dug out, actually. And Keeler's probably the only guy who actually witnessed this, like watched the whole thing happen. So that would have been incredibly traumatic for him. My father sees this is really serious. He runs up. He calls Guy Lampkin, who was an employee of the Dresden Utilities Commission, who'd been serving as a kind of assistant for my dad. And Guy runs or drives to the fire hall, and they start the siren. So you'd hear the sound of the fire trucks coming right away, but you'd also hear, they had in that town, if for serious emergencies like a flood or anything like that, they had an old World War II air raid siren. So that goes on, and it just goes on. And everybody who remembers this will tell you it's going on and on. And townspeople are, the word just travels quickly, and they're running. Anyone with a shovel is jumping in at first, hoping to save the men. People are scrapping to save the men with their bare hands, even. So that you gotta say that the town really responded immediately when this did happen, to their credit. But it was sadly, it was in vain, and it was soon clear that it was going to take a long time to get any bodies out. The first body didn't come out until around midnight. It may have been Dirk Reichson. And then the next two bodies came in the wee hours, who were close to the top. And maybe that's one of the people Dirk Reichson may have been trying to pull out. Those were the two Hoviuses. The Hoviuses are the only ones whose bodies were not, were intact enough that they had an open coffin. So the Hovius family saw their father and their eldest brother in the funeral home, looking essentially normal. Teresa Hovius remembers that there was a little piece of concrete between her brother's teeth, but otherwise, and the other bodies, they were really kind of crushed, and they were just kind of a mess. Yeah. So you really couldn't. So those two. So by early on Thursday morning, you've got 3 bodies out, and the next day, very slowly, they get one and then eventually they get another one, and they don't get the last body, Hendrik Drent, the oldest man, until the Friday morning at 11 o'clock. So it's 38 hours until they've got everybody out. And yeah, so this is in itself traumatic. And then there's, of course, the traumatic news of, each of the families hearing it. They heard it the night of the accident. Mrs. Hovius actually drove to Dresden and was waiting nearby for news, but there wasn't going to be any news, unfortunately.
And Mrs. Hovius then lost her husband and a son, right?
Correct. Yeah, devastated.
And you talk about how traumatic it would have been, obviously for everyone involved,
yeah.
Especially for your well, not especially, but your dad. You said he had to continue work on the project. The families had lost their breadwinners in many cases. Even the wider area, the Dutch immigrant community in the town itself. So could you reflect on that a little bit for all those groups, all those involved?
Yes, it's definitely really traumatic for my dad. I mean, the entry in the diary on the 14th is very kind of like business-like. And then there's no entry at all for 2 weeks. He probably was sent home at some point. His company probably gave him some days off, right? But, there's no question that my father was incredibly traumatized. And my father had this delicate problem. Actually, let's come back to that maybe around the reaction, the official reaction to this whole thing, because that's a whole story unto itself. But I think the real tragedy was, first of all, actually, let's give credit where credit's due. The town of Dresden, like I said, did in fact really rise to the occasion. And I think this was horrifying. And I have spoken to widows of many of the men who actually did the digging and the rescuing. And all of them have said their husbands said nothing about, wouldn't talk about it. It was too awful. In the 1950s, that was the way people dealt with bad things. You didn't talk about them. We today would know that that's not actually very healthy, but that was the reality of that time. I think for the Dutch community, this was just an absolutely stunning blow. On the 17th, they had a mass funeral, 6 coffins at the back of the church. There was in Aylmer, the Christian Reformed Church in Aylmer, there was no room inside. There were people spilling outside, large groups, and people were in absolute shock. They just, this is 5 people out of their congregation. And actually, Dirk Reichsen had been in that congregation too before he and his wife had moved to Byron. So there, the Byron congregation of the Byron Christian Reformed Church was also connected to this. But all 6 men had been active in that church. 5 families have lost the breadwinner, as you mentioned. And so there was a real shock and grief. The Christian Reformed Church actually did collect money and gave, I think, about $3,000 to each of the widows after maybe 6 months. They collected money from all across the continent, actually. And the idea was that each of these widows could either pay down their mortgage or have a down payment to get a home. They wanted to help these families at least have a home, right? So there was that. There was workers' compensation. It was pretty low. It tended to be based on what they had earned the previous years, and the year rather. And it was a percentage of that, not the amount they'd earned. Well, these guys were mostly casual laborers, right? So their income, especially and they were paid in cash, by the way, but their income was on paper was really low. So this was incredibly difficult for all of them, like many other Dutch families. But in this case, because it was just literally survival, the kids had to work. So the kids were out harvesting tobacco. The Hovius family became pro tobacco harvesters. They were harvesting strawberries. They were doing cleaning, anything they could do just to sort of help ends meet. So yeah, it was difficult, but we can get to the reaction. There's other stuff I want to say about this, but I don't want to keep talking.
No, that's perfectly fine. It's I want to hear as much about the story as I can. Although we've got the film to look forward to and to see later. But maybe briefly, your dad, because you mentioned you didn't know about it. You had to ask your mom about it.
Yes.
I want to ask, how did it affect your dad? But you don't even probably know that much. He didn't talk about it. And it seems like not a lot of people have talked about this until now. Why is that? Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think there's a couple of elements at work here. So I think the town of Dresden, or at least the townspeople of Dresden, we've got that 1950s mentality of, if it's something awful, don't talk about it, and sort of stiff upper lip and just go on. So I think there's the psychology of the 50s is one factor. For the Dutch community, although people were, really devastated, these were well-liked men and, families that everybody knew and all that. There's also just pure survival. They've got, all of them are up against it. And so, as immigrants, they just got to get on with life and they got to focus on their work. So anyone who knows these families, they know about this to this day. So those people did not forget. But
and imagine, if I can just briefly interrupt, this is not the first tragedy they go through. For the older ones amongst that community, they lived through the Depression in the Netherlands, then 5 years of brutal occupation, then
right.
immigrating, being ripped away from their home turf and being moved across the ocean to a land they didn't know anything about, where they didn't speak the language. Yes. And now, over top of this tragedy.
That's correct. I think that's a really important point, Tom. We're talking about tragedy or trials and tribulations, and for the families in particular, culminating in sort of the worst thing that could possibly happen from, a family, especially traditional, a patriarchal family, the way it would have been, the way they would have all thought of it at that time, right? So this was really devastating. Now, if I talk to especially children or grandchildren of those men, so, many of them will say, like, we don't only see this as a tragedy. We see this as a triumph. We see this as, we didn't give up, right? I'll take the Hovius family, who are definitely central in this story, partly because 2 of them died. But the Hoviuses are a really interesting bunch. Here they were planning to be farmers and fully setting on it, saving money to buy a farm, all that kind of stuff. And the minute this happened, those kids, they knew immediately, I'm not going to be a farmer. I am not leaving school. And they become lawyers and professors and incredibly accomplished academic and professional people, because they had to. They saw right away. And in fact, John Hovius, who's in the film, I think he also realized, like, he'd seen what had happened to family not getting, the full protection of the law or the full benefit of the social. And so he went into law, he and his son. So the grandson of Anna Hovius is also doing that law, working with, disenfranchised, marginalized, indigenous people and stuff like that. So they really took that experience to heart, and it became, in a way, also their profession. So I think that's really important.
Along a similar note, you told me that your dad went to Delft, which is the most famous Dutch technical university,
right?
To study for his master's in hydraulic engineering, right?
Correct, yes.
Partially maybe as a result of what he experienced here as well?
Well, I do think so. In the past, all my Dutch relatives would say, well, of course he went to Holland to study hydraulic engineering. We're the best at it. And that's not untrue. I mean, the Dutch are certainly, they know their water, right? But I have to say, because of course I did know my dad after this, and my dad always had a real interest in other cultures and in the world. When we lived in Singapore, my dad had a film camera, actually, and he did not only film his cute little kids and his beautiful Dutch wife. He also, in fact, at least as much, he filmed the people. So you can see through the camera what he's interested in. And I just think that my father would have been deeply affected by and felt a certain sense of, like, injustice about what had happened to these men. And and I think this is what I want to come to, is that there wasn't really a reckoning. There was no consequence.
I was going to get to that.
Yeah,
right. Because usually these days, when something like this happens, there'll be a lot of questions asked. There'll be inquests. Regulations will be tightened up. Inspections will be increased. Did any of that happen after Dresden?
I have to say, no, like nothing. There was a technical adjustment to the Trench Excavators Protection Act. The contractor was acquitted of breaching the act. So, according to that act, whenever a construction is going to involve what they call a trench, you have to notify the municipality, and the municipality has to send an inspector. This did not happen. And at the trial, the contractor's lawyer was able to argue, well, it wasn't really a trench. Define trench. The definition of trench, by the way, is 6 feet or more, where the depth exceeds the width. So if it's deeper than it is wide and it's deeper than 6 feet, it's a trench. Now, by the way, this perfectly fit this excavation. So on a technicality, they acquitted the contractor of breaching the act. So that language in the act was in fact changed. And I'm just going to say this, and I've been searching and digging for a long time. That is literally the only consequence I have found anywhere. On the night that this happened, there was a lot of tough talk. You know, the Labor Department inspector from Toronto is talking tough about, possible breaches of the act. The police is going to launch an investigation. People are talking tough. The next day, there's really a little change. The mayor of Dresden says, well, there's no evidence that it was, careless, that there was any kind of negligence in the work site, which I think is an astonishing thing to say when you haven't even got all the bodies out of the ground yet, and you probably don't know the details of it. And there's a real turning away, and you can see it on day 2, or the day after this accident. By the time we get to the inquest, I don't believe there was any real effort to determine what had happened, and they determined it was an accident on flimsy, very unprofessional grounds. My dad is then suddenly in this very awkward position. He's grilled at the inquest for 2 hours, longer even than the contractor, really because he's the only guy who'd said there was a risk here. And now they almost start practically blaming him, even though he is not legally the one who's going to, required to do the inspection. He kept saying we should get an inspection, and they didn't do it. So and the other reason why I would say we can say that there's no effort to really find out what went wrong is if we compare it to something that happened in Toronto 2.5 years later. In Toronto, in 1960, there was a fire underground at Hoggs Hollow. In Toronto, that's on right now where Yonge Street, on where the York Mills subway station is. Underground, they were building a large water main there. And there was a fire, and 5 Italian workers were killed. Everything about that event mirrors what happened in Dresden. Police investigation, inquest, trial. Except when it comes to Hoggs Hollow, you can see what it looks like when they actually want to know what went wrong. If you read the inquest from Dresden, it's, as one of the family members said to me when I shared it with him, it's depressing. It's just depressing to read it. When you read the inquest report from Hoggs Hollow, it's like, oh my God, this is what it looks like when they actually want to know what went wrong. Within 1 month of Hoggs Hollow, they had a royal commission was in action, examining safety in the province, workplace safety across the province. Incredible. They worked for months and months, got submissions from everybody. Included in this was the treatment of Italian workers. Was there discrimination? Italian workers were striking in Toronto at that time, protesting the treatment they were getting.
There's a monument, I believe, in Toronto as well for Italian workers who lost their lives in workplace accidents.
We can learn a lot from the Italian community, actually. Also, at the time...
Sorry to interrupt again, but the Royal Commission, did they, because you said they looked all over Ontario, did they look at Dresden, the Royal Commission, after the Italian tragedy?
That's the shocker. I've done Freedom of Information requests and gone through boxes of papers. There is one indirect reference. Somebody gives a history of the Trench Excavators Protection Act and mentions that there had been 3 trials and that 2 had found conviction and 1 had been acquitted. And that's the only mention of, and they don't mention Dresden. And Dresden, when Hogs Hollow happened, Dresden was still historically the worst workplace accident in Ontario's history.
And it was only a couple of years earlier,
yes,
right?
Only a few years ago, and it's gone.
So,
Yeah.
so that that's shocking.
Yes.
That's absolutely shocking. And you're right. You're talking earlier about how immigrant workers are often treated.
That's right.
Even to this day,
Yeah.
your temporary farm laborers suffer tremendously.
That's correct.
I spoke about that on Dutch radio a couple of years ago.
That's right.
But let's move to your film, because
oh, of course,
it must be really hard to put together. So you're working on, if I'm right, a feature-length documentary film, right?
That's correct.
About the event. But you sketch how difficult it is to find information. So maybe talk about. I think it's pretty clear why you're making the film, but maybe you have something to add there. How hard is it to find, do the research and find the information you need?
Well, I think that maybe the motivation began with when we found my dad's papers, right? I really thought this does not just belong to us. It really should be in a museum. The families of these men should know that this stuff exists, right? And that's when I realized that there's absolutely there's no museum, there's no book. I haven't even met an expert who's even heard of Dresden. It's that bad. The only people who know are people who are directly affected, and one journalist in the town of Dresden, Marie Carter, who came across this in her newspaper's archives, and she's the only person I've yet heard of who actually found it on their own and then wrote an article about it. Otherwise, nobody even knows this happened. So that bothers me, right? And also, my father died in 1994, which I should have mentioned a long time ago, why he's not here to say anything about it. But for me personally, it sort of connects to my father's history, and, it allows me to, in a certain sense, maybe finish something, because he kept all these records, right? Now, I don't know that he had any idea what to do with them, but I feel like I'm doing something with them.
He kept them for a reason.
That's right. He definitely kept them for a reason. I agree with you. But then, of course, as I meet these families, it seems to me just, I feel like 2 injustices have been done. This was an accident that shouldn't have happened, and they lost their fathers and one family, their eldest brother, this way. That's bad enough. But I feel like it's multiplied when the story is kind of literally allowed to disappear. There is a small monument in Dresden today. The families put it there, and they had to argue with the local town council to be able to put it there. There's been essentially zero acknowledgement from the wider community that this happened. And I feel like that's just it just feels so terribly wrong. So I just want to, we can't change a tragedy, but we can at least change one thing. We can acknowledge that it happened. And of course, this is when my history stuff starts ticking in. It's amazing. Like, yes, it's hard to find the information, but it's unbelievable slowly pulling it together. It's like assembling a puzzle, right? And you find all these little pieces and you put it all together. And honestly, nowadays, I should mention the crowd. Oh, actually, no, we are running our crowdfunding campaign right now. That'll be long done by the time this podcast is broadcast. But although please do visit our site, and maybe we can post that afterwards, because anyone who can support this project, we would be grateful for that. But now I lost my train of thought, Tom. Sorry, help me.
We're talking about the film, how hard it was to do the research, and
yes.
I think people, after listening to this, will want to watch the film. So maybe we shouldn't go into further detail on the content. Maybe you can share, though, some of the work you put into. Are there interviews? Is there archival footage? And then when do you expect the film to be shown? When and where? And where can people find out more about the project itself?
Sure. So let me start with what we've been doing. So first, of course, was the research. While finding original records, like the court records, I don't know if we'll ever find them. They may not exist. The police report would be the absolute, the holy grail, because that would be the unfiltered reports of eyewitnesses. We'll probably never find that either. But there are hundreds of newspaper articles. And I just want to emphasize that, a story that is absent entirely today. And there are hundreds of newspaper articles from those days, even in Holland, by the way, at least 7 Dutch newspapers.
I was going to ask you whether it was covered in Holland. Yeah,
that's right. At least 7 that we've found so far. So, piecing that together, meeting every person knows a piece of the story, rather. Everyone will say, or most people will say, oh, I don't remember anything. I'll say, okay, well, let's just run the camera. Let's run the micro. We'll, run the cameras anyway. And lo and behold, you wouldn't believe what people do remember once we start talking about it. And then you start piecing little pieces together. So, for example, John Rijkson, the son of Dirk Rijkson, the foreman, John and his mother left and went back to Holland. They're the only family that returned because she had a young son and she just couldn't make ends meet. And so she returned to Holland. And John said that his mother had gone to the neighbors to watch TV. And that's how she heard about the accident. And that on TV, she'd heard that only 5 men had died. And therefore she thought or hoped, good, that means my husband didn't die. So that's just like a tiny little thing you hear in an interview out of, dozens and dozens of hours of interviews. Well, later on, I found the I found the TV footage, by the way, which is incredible. It shows even my young dad in the footage. But also I found the transcripts of the newsreader. So in those days, they'd play a film, like an actual celluloid film, while a newsreader read the script. Well, I found the script. Lo and behold, they say on the TV script, 5 men have died. So that's just like a small detail, but this is the way you kind of slowly piece everything together and confirm it and so forth. And it is incredibly exciting. I'm thrilled to discover that I wasn't only thrilled about history as a teacher, but I'm thrilled about history, on the ground, actually looking for original material. So that's really exciting. We've already shot about 20 interviews so far. We have found a fairly decent amount of archival footage and especially archival photos. We've touched just the tip of the iceberg of the newspaper articles, and that's where we're going to find a lot of more. There's a lot of work to do there. And now we're doing a crowdfunding campaign to hopefully fund the entire filming part of the process that we want to do this summer and early fall. Complete all the interviews with other family members, with experts like Anne von Aragon, for example, who has written an incredible book about the child's experience of immigration of a Dutch immigrant. So we'll kind of hopefully have the film in the can, if you will, by, let's say, the end of September. And then we begin the editing process. And I very much hope that we can finish the film in 2025, if we're lucky, right about now, next year, 12 months from now. But that will depend entirely on funding. And funding a film is incredibly difficult right now. So it's an oversaturated market. And so we just have to do this in steps. Crowdfunding gets us through production. At that point, I go to Holland and I'm going to try to get a broadcast pre-sale. I think we're going to definitely get a lot of interest from the Dutch. I will actually use the broadcast pre-sale in Holland to finance filming in Holland, because I'd actually want to finish some of this. That's part of this story too, where they came from and so forth. And then we kind of keep going, then we start pitching other production companies. CBC and TVO I've tried this year. I'm going to try them again next year. Every step we bring the project further, it does become more attractive, right? So whatever we can do, and that's why our self-financing or crowdfunding is an incredibly valuable tool for us. The other reason why crowdfunding is good is, perhaps you can imagine, a lot of people feel deeply connected to this story, and not just Dutch Canadians. first of all, a lot of the Dutch immigration story has not really been told. It's not part of the Canadian
agree. Yeah.
psyche. People don't really know this story, and it's a heck of a story, right? And second of
And,
all,
and the Dutch were one of the largest immigrant groups in the
correct.
1950s.
That's correct. A very important one, right? And then the second part of this is people involved in workplace safety, people who've experienced a workplace tragedy themselves. You would not believe how emotional they become when they hear this story. And so crowdfunding is a kind of a valuable thing. It's not only about raising money, it's also about kind of building a community around them, because there are people who really care about this, and not only like family members of it. Once they hear it, they really care about it. So that's also very gratifying and very important. And I really do believe this will work because of that, because there's just a lot of people who will, really happily, at least morally, support this because they want this film to be made.
Well, it's obvious how passionate you are about the project, Eric, and how well you managed to convey your drive to get this to the finish line. So I am really, it's odd to use the word "looking forward," but I'm looking forward to see the film when it's completed. We'll post your website below the video on YouTube.
Thank you.
Maybe mention it right now, and then.
Yes. Yeah, so our website is very simple, Dresden1957.com, Dresden 1957.com. And that's where whatever's going on, if there's another crowdfunding or anything like that happening, you'll be able to find that on the website.
Well, I'm so glad you had the time to come talk to us about the project. I think it's tremendously important for many, many reasons that you mentioned. Eric, thank you so much.
Yeah, Tom, thank you. I appreciate it too. Great to meet you, and thank you for having me on the show.
Well, listen, this is a fascinating story. It should be a film. It has all the makings of a film, and as it arrives, I'll be fascinated to know what the reception of this film will be. How do you feel about the story, Tom?
Yeah, it's one of the most noticeable things is that this seems to have been swept under the rug when it happened. As Eric was talking about, the commission into that accident that took place in Toronto 2 years later went into depth, but didn't even look at the precedent of what had happened here. And the fact that this story is lain hidden for such a long time is an indication that we should bring it to the forefront. It really also focuses on how new immigrants are vulnerable. And even to this day, that's still the case. And it also goes into workplace safety issues that remain important. So I think it's very commendable, and that Eric's telling the story. As you heard, he's still raising funds to get to the next stage of his production. But at least the story is coming out now through his website, and also, for example, through our podcast here.
It's incredible to me, having grown up a kid of the '60s, late '60s, born in Ontario. This would be a story that you think you would have heard. Something of industrial lore that would have been told time and time again. Yet, as you say, it was swept under the rug. It'll be fascinating to see this movie, and we wish him great
And what you
success.
say about growing up in Ontario, I felt the same. As I know a lot of stories about immigration, and this is so much related to the immigration story of the Dutch, 6 Dutch casualties. I'd never heard of it either, and it's not well known within the Dutch community either. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Good thing that this is being brought to a wider audience.
Well, this is the guarantee we make. Stories from out of places you just didn't expect, and stories that you think would have been told. We're always discovering something here. Thanks again for that, Tom, and thanks to Eric. Great success with your story, and of course with your the release of the movie. I think it'll be fascinating. Listen, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and reach out to us if you would like to. We'd love to hear from you at dutchthemedia.com. Tom, thank you so much for such a nice show.
Thank you, Mike, and see you next time.
See you next time.